I'm now going to take you through a Band 5 Inspector Calls answer, so you can have an idea of how you can demonstrate the skills we just spoke about in the previous video in exam conditions. So this Inspector Calls answer was about Mrs. Burling. This was the question they got last year, and this was full marks, so 35 out of 35, and then full marks for the spag and the vocabulary. So I'm going to read through it, and then I'll explain how, as I go along, I'll explain how it demonstrates the skills. So, as the play begins, it reveals the identity of the Burlings and that they are a family of high status and wealth. Now, those of you who watched the previous video, you can see here that she's not started with an overview. She's just sort of done a generic sentence, really. It's not even focused on Mrs. Burling, the question. But she still managed to get full marks, and that's obviously because of what comes later. However, it is still good practice to start with an overview that is focused on the character you've been given. So, Mrs. Burling is described as a rather cold woman and her husband's social superior. So there's a tick there because she's embedded straight away quotations from the text. At once Priestley reveals, so there's a focus on the writer straight away. I'll just read a bit more actually. At once Priestley reveals that Mrs. Burling is a cold woman. From the language he uses, this suggests that she lacks emotion and sympathy towards others. Okay, so we've got a focus on the writer, we've got an embedded quotation, and we've got a comment on the language that she lacks emotion and sympathy. That's a good solid inference of what a cold person is. And the focus on towards others is important and has warranted a tick there because that's obviously what the play is centrally about. Also, the fact that she is her husband's social superior, there is a missing apostrophe there that they've not picked up on, implies that she strives to become even higher on the social hierarchy, possibly by gaining more wealthy rather than distributing it. Sorry, I don't feel like I've read that very well. She strives to become even higher on the social hierarchy, possibly by gaining more wealth. Oh, that's why. Rather than distributing it. So what we've got here then is you can already see that the student knows where they're going with this argument. They've interpreted this idea of her being a social superior, not just by saying, oh, so that means that she's better than her husband, or she's got more manners than her husband, or I don't know, that she would have had a better upbringing than her husband. They're thinking straight away about Priestley's central ideas. So this idea that she would rather become more wealthy herself than distributing it to others, which obviously then they're able to link to the fact that it foreshadows that as the play progresses, her cold ways will be unleashed by having an extreme lack of sympathy when discovering the death of Eva Smith and her association with her. So a tip there, because we've got a cross-reference to the rest of the play. As the play progresses, there's a lovely phrase. You've got the terminology, the awareness of writer's method, foreshadowing, and linking then to obviously her reaction to Eva Smith's death at the end. That's not an obvious link, social superior, to her lack of sympathy. However, what they've done really nicely is they've embedded both quotations here in the summary. They've looked at cold, they've looked at social superior, they've brought them together in this final comment here, which is really cohesive and lovely. It is a girl who wrote this, by the way. I might sometimes say them. As well as this, within the first act, Priestley reveals how she has stubborn traditionalist attitudes, and it is obvious to the differences. And is oblivious to the differences within the younger generation. So that's a really clear argument about Mrs. Burling. It's focused on what Priestley does. Priestley reveals, really nice, is conscious action. And this is a very clear argument. She's stubborn and traditionalist, and that summarises up her attitudes, and she's oblivious to the younger generation. It would possibly be easier to argue that as two different arguments. However, like I say, got full marks, so you can't argue. What an expression, Sheila. Really, the things you girls pick up these days. So we've got direct evidence to support. If you were a student who's getting band 3 or 4 rather than 5, you might not remember this quotation. You might not be able to recall direct evidence to support every single argument. Here, her disgust with the choice of language used by Sheila. So the word disgust there is inferring correctly how Mrs. Burling feels. By Sheila during the engagement dinner, her appalled retaliation, emphasizes the fact that she is contrasting to her children. So basically this idea that Priestley served her up as a contrast. So there's a focus there on how this is sort of getting into the other characters idea that we talked about in sport in the previous video. So how she's used to contrast to her children. That's really good evidence, isn't it, of the divide between the generations. And that is, again, that's what we call a pertinent quotation, like the best quotation you could use to highlight a contrast. Thus linking to the theme of the younger generation. So like we said when we did sport, trying to link to themes at the end of your arguments, as the age gap between them causes Mrs. Berlin to live with a permanent ideology of capitalism. That's a lovely phrase, isn't it? You can see why that would have got a high marks. The register there is lovely, and the understanding of an ideology of capitalism. And the idea that people should live by the moral every man for himself, from which she cannot escape. Okay, so there's an implication here from which she cannot escape actually could be developed, and think about how Mrs. Berling is sort of trapped by her own ideologies. She's trapped by the way she's been raised to think, valuing capitalism and valuing what essentially is suggested here is basically individualism, isn't it? This idea of every man for himself. So a really clear understanding of what Priestley's used her to represent there. Yet the younger generation, i.e. Sheila, are able to reform, great word, it's a great Priestley word, and again just sort of really emphasises an inherent understanding of what the play is. They initiate a change in society. Excuse me. The younger generation's willingness would have been apparent to an audience watching, given that society had transformed. This is really a contextual point that will have been embedded into her understanding of the play marks. There wouldn't be separate points for context. The implication being that obviously this was after World War II and a time when things like the NHS and social welfare were being implemented, or at least the play was around the same time. The play was published earlier. First performed a bit earlier. The use of punctuation here, particularly the exclamation mark, further highlights Mrs. Berling's feelings towards the younger generation. So a brief comment on language here. That's not necessarily band 5 for AO2, but you should always try and focus on the language throughout the whole essay. As the play progresses into Act 2, so really clear, cohesive, structured essay. We're now moving on to Act 2. The use of structure results in Mrs. Berling's interaction with the inspector to be exceedingly dramatic. All right, so there's an inherent use of terminology here linked to dramatic effects. So this is the other major terminology mark you can get, is exploring how the play is a traditional drama and using a lot of drama terms. So thinking about structure and thinking about the dramatic effect. This is due to the fact that at the end of Act 1, during the inspector's interrogation, she is not present. Right, perfect. That is really, really perceptive and insightful to think about the idea that when the character isn't on the stage, that obviously then has an impact on the choices later. So it's very critical. They're really thinking about how she's been set up here because she wasn't on the stage in Act 1, and Priestley's conscious decision to do that. So when re-entering in Act 2 to experience her interrogation, really nice word, interrogation, she is unaware of the inspector's tactics, brilliant, and method of exposing the family. So just a really inherent understanding there of what the inspector's role is in the play, even though that's not the focus of the question. I can see why it's got full marks, because the examiner will have really thought this child has really understood and got this play, and that should be evident throughout everything you write really within it. In the extract she states, so you can see now the use of the extract, and it's really nice to say in the extract. I think it really just shows that you're really engaged with the task that they've set you. She states, "I've done nothing wrong and you know it." Here she is very defensive, so that's your first inference about that character based on that quotation. And she's defending her actions as she feels justified within her decision. Okay, yes, she very much feels justified. This is nice psychoanalysis now as well. Her ego is represented here when she finds that she has done nothing wrong, and also in the extra when she states, "I did nothing I'm ashamed of." So we've got here a cross-reference. Yep. So we found one quotation to show that she feels justified, she's being egotistic, she's being defensive, and now we've got another one, I did nothing I'm ashamed of. This is both a use of hubris, so hubris is a pride, basically, that she has too much pride, given that her actions will almost immediately haunt her when she discovers Eric's association with Edith Smith. Right, so before I carry on reading that, this is really nice. Again, it's a cross-reference, isn't it? But there's engagement here in this word immediately. That word immediately says to the examiner, I understand the structure of this play really well, and I know that very soon after this moment, immediately after this moment, she's going to find out about Eric. Just that word immediately tells the examiner, I know the order of this play really well, and I know why this moment matters so much. She then develops that really nicely by talking about dramatic irony. So she discovers Eric's association with Edith Smith, and dramatic irony as her actions are in fact diabolical and almost evil. Quite dramatic about language there, but again, true, yeah. So interpretation of the character, inferences there, as she essentially reduced Eva to death by refusing her aid when she was at her most vulnerable state. Again, not quite spelled vulnerable right there, but again, a really good understanding of the character, a really good understanding of what she did to Eva and why it mattered so much, just by including this, her most vulnerable state. She's not waffled on and said, oh, you know, because she was pregnant and because this was her last resort and because she committed suicide afterwards. You don't need to do all that. Just state the fact that if she was at a most vulnerable state, and the examiner goes, yes, this student gets it. And they've justified, haven't they, this dramatic language, because yes, she basically, essentially, you could say, was the final nail in the coffin, wasn't she? Oh, literally. So she's totally unaware that the inspector is omniscient and does have the authority to impose change and regret among the family. So that's critical as well. So she's thinking about the inspector's role there, but then Mrs. Berlin's ignorance towards that. And she feels because he isn't socially powerful, this strips him of all authority. That again inherently understands Mrs. Berlin's attitude towards the world. She looks down upon the poor, neglecting them of any remorse, e.g. girls of that class. A really important quotation to summarise Mrs. Berlin's attitude. So pertinent quotation there. That's really one of those quotations that if you missed, maybe you haven't really got that solid knowledge of Mrs. Berlin in terms of that really sums her up really well. Could I mean, obviously again it got full marks, but could think about here, you know, Priestley highlights then through this, if you wanted to link this at a band 5, which she has done elsewhere, so it doesn't matter if she hasn't done it here, but you could say that so through this Priestley's highlighting that you know, perceived power, or power doesn't always come from social status. There are other types of powers that should be respected by the upper classes. Okay, morality being one of them. There is then a climax intention. So climax is a structural technique word that you will get terminology marks for due to the structure used when Eric enters to be exposed in Act 3. As Mrs. Berlin feels the only person to blame for her death is the father of the child. Yet Sheila and the audience have already analysed the pattern of events to conclude Eric is the father. Brilliant. Really good understanding of the dramatic structure that Priestley's used here and why it's effective. And just an awareness of the fact that the audience would have already got this, which is what makes it so frustrating when she keeps on saying it. But also you kind of delight in her downfall, don't you? However, her extreme ignorance, again, inference perfectly embedded, perfectly linked to the character in the play, not only to the inspector but in general, e.g. to the suffering of the poor, restrict her from realising this. That's really nice. That's a really good understanding of what Priestley's suggesting about how the dangers of ignorance and how it can affect you, not just other people. Even though she's not explicitly said, through this, Priestley highlights the dangers of ignorance, and that actually it can lead to you suffering, not just other people. There's an inherent understanding of that fact, and that's why she's getting these band 5 marks. This dramatic irony contributes to the tension, and only when Eric enters she realises the truth. So linking again to the impact for thinking about it in terms of the drama and on the stage as the play. Eric proceeds to reveal his association with Eva, The only sympathetic aspect of her character is revealed when discovering she has caused the death of her potential grandchild. Right, the best thing here is the only sympathetic aspect of her character. This is evaluative. I'm going to do an either. That is really evaluative to be able to sort of select this one part of this character and be able to look at the play as a whole and draw out the idea that this is the only moment in the entire play when you actually feel or could feel sympathy for her because she feels like she's caused the death of her potential grandchild. It's the word only sympathetic. That makes it evaluative, that makes it cohesive. There's full engagement there. This student knows the play inside out. Quotation, again, can't draw a line. Beautiful. It can't be true. Support the argument. You always need that. She remains in denial of association with either still, but only has a slight change in character because of Burling, the unborn child, has also been affected. Therefore showing Mrs. Burling is only concerned for the well-being of herself and her family, and she has no remorse for the pain she inflicted upon Eva Smith. Okay, so here we've got another understanding of the fact that not just it's evaluative, because she's not just saying, oh, you know, she cares that she cares now that Eva's died. It's actually thinking about the fact that, well, critically, well, actually, she only cares because it was a family member who she's now caused pain to. She still doesn't actually care about Eva Smith herself. Or by the end of it, she still doesn't care about the fact that this could be affecting other girls and that her snobbery has led to somebody has turned down aid. She doesn't care about any of that. She only cares about the fact that in this one situation, her grandchild would have suffered. So her lesson is very minimal. So there may be a scope to develop that, but you've got to remember that this is a 45-minute exam conditions, and that the things that you might be sitting here now thinking, oh, well, she could have written that, she could have written that, in an exam condition wouldn't, you know, you just don't have time to write everything. So you can see here, this is the only commentary that the exam board will make. So band 5 for AO1, band 5 for AO2, and high, consistently accurate spelling, punctuation, grammar. You can see it's not perfect, so that hopefully will be reassuring to some of you about the quality of your spag. So yeah, full mark answer there. If you've got any questions about that, just pop them in the comments box below. And next up will be band 5 Christmas Carol.